Hello and welcome to this support video for the ZenWorks Service Desk on how to set up email with OAuth token authentication. The agenda today is to discuss the service provider documentation and understand that as they change and evolve their systems, there may be changes to this documentation. Also, the email service provider constraints, the ZenWorks Service Desk integration parameters, and a demonstration followed by references. For OAuth token authentication, be sure to have your service provider documentation handy. As the service provider evolves, obviously we can't control what processes may change in their process, so keep their documentation handy for reference. Providers have slightly different terms for IDs, like Microsoft Application ID equals Client ID. Other terms, depending on the vendor, like redirect URI, may be referred to differently with Microsoft as web, and Google calls it web applications. Others may call it a web service. So be aware of these terms for your service provider. Some precedent concerns: be aware that global security tenant policies and existing and previous Azure AD email configurations and Azure Global settings is enabled to enforce for multi-factor authentication and cannot be overridden. For the ZenWorks service integrations, the OAuth token authentication is a manual process to get the tokens, but is very mature. And the demonstration in this video, it is created with a developer account, so your service provider settings may be a little different depending on the account type. And be patient when using Azure AD. It may take 1 to 5 minutes for those Azure changes to replicate and make available. Now we're going to examine the ZSD OAuth token authentication configuration for ZSD using Azure AD as a user source and Office 365 as our email. Here we have the ZSD documentation handy so that we can set up our OAuth email. Within the documentation, it has a lot of notes to be aware of, as well as a lot of different parameters that you may need for your setup. So we have that handy. Next, we've documented all our ZSD email settings for this OAuth authentication for backup purposes and reference later. When we go to Setup, we can either select IMAP S or POP3S, and you'll notice that an Use OAuth checkbox appears. So we'll select IMAP S and Use OAuth for the incoming server, and the outgoing server will select the OAuth button. That sets up our parameters for what we need to input for our configuration. In Azure AD, we're going to go to Azure AD Directory. We're going to then go to App Registrations and do a new registration for this particular server. In this case, we'll call it ZenWorks Service Desk OAuth. This is an account for this organizational directory only. It is a single tenant. We'll select Web, and we'll put in the URL that we found in the documentation. This particular URL we need to copy and put in the full distinguished name. So we'll modify that here. Once that's done, we can select Register. Now that we have the app registered for this server, we have all the IDs, we're going to also go to the API permissions. So we'll go to API permissions, and we'll make sure that we add the permissions necessary for this email configuration. We'll go to Microsoft Graph, we'll do delegated permissions, and we'll search for IMAP, select that particular permission, SMTP, and select that particular permission, and offline. We'll select that particular permission, add the permissions, which they become in the list, and then we'll grant the admin consent for this particular application, which is for this ZenWorks server. Next, we have the account for the ZenWorks Service Desk, and it should have access to IMAP and SMTP. So we'll go into the user directory and check out our Service Desk account. By selecting our Service Desk account, we're going to go in and we're going to do Manage Apps, or we'll go to Mail first. Once we get there, we can go to Manage Email Apps. And you'll notice that IMAP and POP and Authentication SMTP are available for this user. Make sure you save that. Now we're going to fill in the receiving or incoming server identifiers. The port is default, so we'll leave it the same. We're going to go ahead and put in the username, the account used that harvests the inbox. Then we'll go over to Azure ID and get the application or client ID. And we can put that in both incoming and outgoing for the client ID. Well, we can also put the same username in. Next, we're going to go to the client credentials. We need to get a new client secret. So we'll put in a description. We'll specify when it expires, typically 12 months. And then we'll have a value, not the secret ID, but you want the value to be put in here under the client secret. And that can be repeated down in the sending. Next, we're going to do the scope. And this is in the documentation. We just cut and paste that into the scope. And now we have the auth URL. So this is the scope for the sending. And we've done that now. Now for the auth URL. Again, we're going to cut and paste our tenant ID into this particular specification. So we go to Azure AD, we copy the directory client tenant ID and paste it in here in our documentation. Now we can cut and paste from this page into ZenWorks Service Desk. We also need the token URL, and we'll go ahead and paste those in as well. Now we need to do the reply to, so we'll put in the Service Desk account and the outgoing server for SMTP for Office 365. Those are complete. And it looks like I have spaces in here. Let me take these spaces out. There you go. Now we're going to do a get token for the receiving. And it'll ask us to authenticate into Microsoft for O365. We're going to accept this, at which point we can now copy and paste the access token and the refresh token. And we're going to do the same thing with the outgoing server. So we'll select get tokens, and it'll ask us to authenticate in as a Service Desk account. We'll accept, and we'll cut and paste the outgoing information for access and refresh tokens as well. Once we do that, we should be able to hit save, and then we'll go ahead and test. Notice the access and refresh tokens are X'd out for security purposes. And you can see the incoming server has connected successfully. Demonstration summary. Azure AD, we've registered the ZSD server as an application. We authenticated and added public client flows. We added the API permissions and granted access. Then we made sure that we obtained the OAuth for Gmail parameters, a tenant ID, client ID, get tokens, etc. We allowed for client flows. We enabled the SMTP, IMAP, and offline API permissions. Then we configured the ZSD settings with the documentation. We used the service provider incoming and outgoing servers. We obviously have this service desk account, the IDs, the auth and token URLs. We went ahead and put all those into service desk and we selected get tokens for the access and refresh tokens. We copy those into ZenWorks service desk so that the authentication is complete, and we hit save and we confirm that the test was good. Here are a few references and documentation points for your email settings, for the administration guide for the email setup and documentation, and other resources that you may want to reference for your ZSD setup. Thank you for your time today. I hope you got a lot out of the ZSD OAuth authentication configuration. Have a great day.